So this is my topic of the keynote. I am the director of the Buller Center for Business. There's actually two business families in Manitoba. One's Buller and one's Buller. They're two different families and they don't like getting mixed up. So our center is named after the Buller Center, after Herb and Erna Buller and their family. But I also wanted to say that I'm involved currently in a bunch of other different organizations. What I've found is that you can't actually do what's necessary for sustainable energy to actually make a change in Manitoba at any scale just by working in one organization or with one group of people. We have to figure out, and maybe this is even the theme of my talk, we have to figure out how we can pull together a whole series of resources, often resources and organizations, points of view that don't talk to each other much, that think they disagree, that think they have different goals. We have to figure out how do we pull them together to take shared action. So my theme question is, how can we find a path between hope and despair? Maybe despair is too strong a word. Deep, gnawing worry, maybe that's not much. Despair is good enough. How do we find a path between hope and despair? And there's, of course, lots of reasons why we might find ourselves despairing. This is a coral bleaching event. Right now, the largest coral bleaching event in history is happening on the Great Barrier Reef. For those of you who know coral, it's actually two different species interlocked together. There's the coral itself, and then there's algae that live inside the coral. When the water gets too hot, or it gets too acidic, or they get stressed, the coral expels the algae, and it goes out into the water, and the algae eventually dies. So first it turns white, and then it turns black. This has happened a number of times, but this is the largest and most serious one that we have a record of. If we go to the opposite end of the climate, this is the Arctic, and right now, this is up till the end of March. This is how much ice is on the Arctic Ocean. The dark line with a sort of hint of gray around it, that's the historical norm of what happens every winter. Every winter, more ice comes and then it melts away. The dotted line is what happened in 2011, 2012, which is one of the more recent low years. The blue line is what's happened up till the end of March. So just as in summer we have more open water, in winter we have less ice. And this has a transformative effect. It's both a cause and effect of Arctic warming. If you look at the whole planet, this is, as best as we can tell, the temperature, average earthly surface temperature for the last 140 years, 130 years. And then just in case you think I'm pulling information from radical sources, this is from The Economist, which is not really known as a radical newspaper. The best evidence is we are warming up the planet, and it's not any great mystery why that's happening. This is CO2 levels for the last 400,000 years. And as you can see, every time there's an ice age, the CO2 levels go down, and then when it warms, they come back up again. And it's ranged between 200 and 300 parts per million for 500,000 years. And then something very strange started happening in about 1880. So we were in a warm period, and maybe it was even starting to cool off a little bit, and then suddenly it started spiking up. And it spiked up to a higher level than we have any records of for at least the last 500,000 years. And in fact, in the last little while, it's gone beyond the chart even. And as of April 15th, what's today's date? 16th. So as of yesterday. This is the good and bad thing about the web. You get news right away, and you get both the good news and the bad news right away. So as of yesterday, we were at 408 parts per million. So the despair seems pretty obvious. Those are serious climate change. I'll talk about this a bit more in a bit, but I been privileged to spend some time up in a community called Northlands Denizlikline First Nation, which most people call Lac Brochet because that's the lake that it's on. It's the same latitude as Churchill, but right up against the western part of Manitoba, almost into Saskatchewan. And people have been living in that area for at least 4,000 years. Until the 1960s, they were nomadic, they followed the caribou, and then for a lot of reasons, they settled down into this community. And I was up there first week in December, and there were 5 or 6 men, middle-aged young men, who were standing around in the evening talking. And it reminded me for all the world, like my wife is Mennonite and she grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan. It reminded me of Mennonite men standing around who've been farming and who are worried about the weather. Maybe there's a sign of drought, maybe there's a sign of flood, and they talk and they're worried. And what they were worried about was the weather. That day, December 1st, 2nd, it was above freezing. It's the first time it had been above freezing in December in their memory. And you might think, well, hey, that'd be great, it's not so cold, because often it's 30 or 40 below up there, people would be happy. They're 9 hours by winter road from Lynn Lake. So to get their food and all the necessities up there, except for the fish and caribou that they live on, everything else has to come by winter road. And when it's warm in winter, the winter road starts later and ends sooner. And it was one of those conversations, it wasn't political, people weren't talking about global warming in some kind of theoretical way, or what do we tell those politicians? It was just a group of people standing around worried. And I think that's a realistic assessment of the situation. So where's the hope? I do think there is hope. It's maybe harder to see, but I do think there is good, serious reason for hope. At first, this will not seem like a very hopeful chart. This is gigatons, so millions of tons of CO2 expelled into the air every year to make energy. So as you can tell, since 75, we've been going up pretty steadily, right? But there's one of the places, there's a couple of places you can see where it went down briefly. The first place it went down was after the second oil shock. And so this is an entirely expected thing to happen. When a price goes up suddenly, consumption goes down. But then as soon as people adjusted to that increased price, consumption went up again. And then we had another dip during the worldwide global recession. So this wasn't because oil prices went up, but it was because everybody on average had less money to spend and people cut back. Again, entirely expected, seems to fit standard supply and demand rules or patterns, and it resumed once the economy resumed. But then something really odd happened. The last 2 years, even though the price of oil has collapsed, it's gone from what, $100 a barrel to 40, is it now? And even though economic growth has continued, worldwide economic growth is about 3% a year, CO2 production from energy has leveled off. This is the first time it's happened since they've been keeping these kind of records. And it happened last year, and when it was announced, the suggestion was maybe this is some kind of strange anomaly, we're not sure why this is going on, maybe it'll never happen again. But then it happened again in 2015. If you drill down into the numbers a little bit, GDP grew 3.5% around the world. CO2 production, which usually grows in lockstep with GDP, didn't. And a really surprising thing is the two largest emitters, even though both of them had their economy grow, China and the United States, in both cases, their CO2 production went down. So why did this happen? If we're going to try to figure out if this is actually hopeful, we have to understand why. One of the main things that happened is during that period, the last couple of years, our society has continued to create more sources of energy and produce more energy. But in the last year or two, 90% of that has come from renewables. So it doesn't mean that 90% of all energy is from renewables, it means 90% of all the new stuff comes from renewables. And about half of that is from wind. If you think about Manitoba, Manitoba has 2 wind farms. And we've had 2 wind farms for pretty well a decade now. We are completely out of step with what's going on in the world. Wind farms are getting built like mad. If we drill down a little bit more in the United States, what's going on? Yeah, wind farms are playing a role in the United States, but an even bigger role is the switch from coal to oil, to natural gas for making electricity. So this is one of the surprising, and I would argue good consequences of fracking. Yes, fracking has serious problems, but it also has a really serious benefit. Will this last forever? Are we going to run out of the natural gas? Is this really a long-term solution? Those are all really good questions, but the change is real. And it's allowed the United States to be one of the countries where, even though the economy grows, their CO2 production has gone down. And in China, China has emerged as both the biggest problem in energy production and pollution, and also the biggest solution. So in 5 years, think about how fast this is. They've gone from 80% of their electricity from coal down to 70%. So, huge country, huge amount of coal, chopped out 10% of it. Our neighbor to the west, Saskatchewan, gets most of its electricity from coal. People don't talk about that much, but that's where they get most of their energy from. I can guarantee you their percentage of energy from coal has not gone down in the same way in the same time. And then the rest, where do they make up that 10%? It's mainly from hydro and wind. So to go from 19% of your energy for a huge country like that to almost 30% of the energy in 5 years, that is a serious change. And those kind of large-scale, serious changes result in having a disconnecting, a decoupling of economic growth from CO2 production. I wouldn't want you to think that those are the only 2 countries that are doing this. In early April, the World Resources Institute compiled some really interesting information. There are 21 countries in the world that have had economic growth in the last 15 years while simultaneously having CO2 reduction. So we could look at some of these stars, and these tend not to be really famous. But Hungary, who knew that Hungary grew by 1/4 and shrank its CO2 production by 1/4? The United Kingdom grew by 27% and shrank its production, CO2 emissions, by 20%. Ukraine, for all of the troubles and struggles in Ukraine, 50% growth, 30% decline in CO2 production. These are revolutionary changes. They're not actually 1 or 2 year flukes. They're not 1 or 2 country anomalies. This is a vanguard of countries. Do you notice which country is not on this list? It should be right after Bulgaria and right before Czech Republic. And I don't mean Canary Islands. Canada is not on this list. We have not been part of this revolution. So in some ways, the transformation that I find myself longing for, the hope that I look for, is not here. It's happening, but it's not happening here. I gave you this sort of list of organizations I've been involved with. One of them is the Manitoba Roundtable on Sustainable Development. This is supposed to be the main place in Manitoba where government leaders, business people, community leaders, advocates meet together to try to figure out how to make our province more sustainable. Been on for about 2 years, and I have to tell you, I cannot find serious partners on the government side. The government has been very serious about talking about doing these things. So they committed to Kyoto, they went to Paris, there are policies, plans, all sorts of things laid out. But when it actually comes to doing things, it has been a difficult challenge. So we could either say that we've failed as advocates on that committee, or we're in the pre-success stage, or we haven't found a way of moving those levers. So can we find a path between hope and despair? The despair seems pretty obvious. I do believe there are solid reasons for hope. And the real question, to me the core question, is can we find that path? We don't have to do it from scratch because it's being done all around the world in all sorts of different ways, by wealthy countries, by poor countries, by medium well-off countries, by countries with similar consumption patterns as us, by countries with different consumption patterns. It's being done. And the challenge for us isn't to do something new, but to finally join that change. So here's what I think is true. I do think that the rising level of CO2 is a serious problem. It may be the most serious problem we have on the planet and in our society right now. The only solution I can see to it is a move to renewable energy. There's been an astonishing amount of money spent on sequestration research and development in Manitoba, in Canada. This is the idea where you can still keep producing as much CO2, but you can somehow put it back into the earth or back into the bottom of the ocean. And if you look at the spending patterns on research and development in energy in Canada in the last 10 or 15 years, a large bulk of that money has gone to that. I could well be wrong, I'm often wrong, but I can't see any path in that process that leads to commercially viable, scalable activity. I don't see how you can get that many gigatons of CO2 out of the air once you put it in the air, or that you can get it out of the smokestack while you're burning the fossil fuels. So the only real solution that I can see is a move to renewable energy. The market, what do we want to call this? We can call this capitalism, the free market, how we buy and sell stuff, the worldwide economy, whatever phrase you want to put on it, it's the dominant pattern of how we exchange goods and services amongst ourselves and amongst countries in our world. There are some people who say, well, you know what, once this becomes an obvious and serious problem, the market will find solutions, it always does. We got off whale oil and switched to kerosene, it'll happen like that again, it'll be fine. I don't see that the evidence for that is good. Left on its own, I don't think the market will make these changes. And the reason for that isn't any great mystery, it's not some kind of dark conspiracy. It's a problem called externalities, where if I buy something from you, let's say I come to your house and I buy a dozen eggs from you. If the full cost of those eggs are built into the price, so whatever it costs to make those eggs, I actually have to pay the full amount, then you will make eggs or not, and I will buy them or not based on that market cost. But if one of us can shove some of the costs off onto other people, off onto the wider society, then more eggs will get made and more eggs will get bought and consumed than is rational. And that's what's going on with fossil fuels Instead of the consumers of fossil fuels, all of us, having to pay the full price of the fossil fuel, including all of the global warming effects and all of the costs that that will entail, we've been able to shove that cost off onto the wider society and especially off onto the future. So if current trends continue, Florida goes underwater, becomes uninhabitable, nobody who bought gasoline in the previous 100 years will have to pay that cost. So because we're not having to pay the full externalities, we continue to consume in a way that doesn't benefit the larger society over the long term. And so the market on its own, unless it changes, isn't going to solve the problem. But I also think, and I often hear people, this is a point where many of you may find yourself disagreeing, and trust me, in the next few slides you may disagree even more. I also don't think that pushing against the market or trying to somehow sneak around the market is going to actually work either. The market forces, the way we buy and sell, the way we live our lives in this world is so huge, powerful, dominant. The idea that we can, oh well, if we just get off of the grid or we just get off of the market and buy and sell everything amongst ourselves or build everything ourselves, I don't actually think that we can scale that up enough to make a big, serious difference. And remember, we're talking about millions of tons a year. We need to make a big, serious difference. I also think that trying to constrain economic growth, so if the problem is we have too much CO2, the way to solve this is we'll just shrink our economy, and that way we'll have less, or we'll get into some kind of steady state, and that way we'll be able to have less CO2 and we'll be okay. I don't think that works. I don't think it's wise, and I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's wise because what it's really recommending is decades of recession. If we're talking about shrinking the economy in a serious way, we're talking about the 1930s on steroids for decades and decades. That level of suffering is, I think, deeply unwise. I don't think there's any mechanism on the planet that would actually achieve that if we could. Can you imagine saying to, let's say you go to the next political debate during the election this year and you say, I will vote for any one of you if you promise to reduce the economic growth of Manitoba. Which one of you will vote for, if elected, that your party will try to reduce the economic growth? I'm not even sure the Green Party candidate would agree to that. It is not possible, I don't think, achievable or realistic to expect political leaders and political parties to say, our goal is going to be to shrink the economy, because that's the only way we can survive CO2 production. So that means that our challenge, both of those of us who want to change how we consume energy, what kind of energy we consume, it means that our challenge when dealing with the market is to chart a path for economic growth that is more profitable than the current path. So we have to figure out not only how do we force people to switch from one kind of gas-consuming vehicle to electric vehicle in a way that people won't rebel, but we also have to figure out how do we get that switch to happen in a way that people actually want to do it, that the businesses who are engaged in it want to do it. How do we make it more profitable? It's a real problem. When we think about this problem and how do we deal with rising CO2 levels, how do we move from escalation to de-escalation, I think we need to be honest that Manitoba is only going to play a small role. Canada is only going to play a small role. We're not 20% of the CO2 production on the planet. We're in the single digits. And within Canada, Manitoba is in the single digits. So, but just because we're going to play a small role doesn't mean we should make any less effort. And I think we need to be honest that right now Manitoba is not leading this process. We're barely even in the game. So there are, and you can see them around this room, there are people who are engaged every day in trying to build viable businesses to make these transformations. There are people every day, many of them are you, who are engaged in trying to have their communities and their own individual behaviors and families make these transformations. But we need to be honest with ourselves and say, as a province, we are not yet leading. We have many, many small possibilities and signposts of where we can go and what we can do. But in Canada, the three leading are probably Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and BC. We're not in the top 3. We're not even in the top half. And Canada, as we saw, is not in the top tier of countries in the world on this. So we have to figure out how do we move from where we are to at least the middle and maybe above average. I also don't think that the challenges are technological. By that I mean, the problem isn't that we don't have photovoltaic cells that work well. We have photovoltaic cells that work well. The problem isn't that we don't have insulation that can make our houses more efficient. It's right over there. The problem isn't that we don't have electric vehicles or any of the other technologies that we need. I think the problem is that we are lousy at taking shared action. And that's not something unique to Canadians or Manitobans. Human beings are lousy at taking shared action. And we spend a huge amount of effort in trying to figure out who's at fault and how to blame them. So it must be those politicians, it must be those bureaucrats, it must be those business people, it must be those unrealistic advocates and community fanatics. It must be individuals, it must be somebody else, and we must be able to figure out how to get them to change what they're doing. To me, that is an entirely non-useful way of trying to figure out how to make these changes. The challenge is to figure out, okay, how do we find and promote businesses, or find and promote community organizations, political leaders, civil servants, departments, that can work on this together with us. So I'd like to sketch out what I think are 2 possible paths. One is kind of an example. I talked a little bit about Northlands, and I'll talk a little more about that, and I think it sketches out the beginning of a possible path. And then the other one is a more generic model, actually invented by that guy over there, Eric Bibot. And I'll talk about him later. It's okay, he doesn't have to do anything, I just mentioned his name and now he's worried. Okay. All right, a community plan and the red-green plan. It's not named after the TV star, it's named after him. There's a community that I talked about up north. It's called Northlands Denisuscline. That's the language, they speak Dene, a specific dialect of Dene. And they were nomads until the 1950s. And then they moved off of nomadic lifestyle and moved into what I would call lousy housing. And until the early 1990s, their houses were entirely heated by wood. And then in early 1994, I think it was, all of the houses and buildings switched over to diesel heat. There are a number of problems with diesel heat. You have to truck it up, you have to store it, you have to deliver it to every single house, because every single house has its own fuel tank beside it. And the biggest problem is that it leaks. So Aki Energy, which is one of those groups I'm involved with, they're an organization that works on First Nations communities to teach and manage the geothermal installations. So Peguis First Nation, Rosa River, a number of other places, oh, it's not Rosa River, Peguis, a couple of other places. They go in, bring together a group of local people in that community, train them on how to do geothermal installations, and then help them manage the geothermal installations. And so far, they've done about 250 houses on 4 different communities. Most of the money stays in the community, the skills stay in the community, and the cost of heating drops in half. The houses are heated better, people like living in them better because the heating system gets retrofit, and expenses go down and jobs go up. They were asked by Northlands and by the federal government, is there anything you can do about the diesel in Northlands Dennissuswine? Because right now there are at least 5 areas in the community that have diesel that's leaked out of the tanks and into the ground underneath. And one of them is underneath the school, and one of them is underneath the Head Start building. And it turns out that's not a really good thing for young kids to have happening, is to have diesel underneath the ground. And so the federal government will pay for the cleanup, but they said, is there not some way we can have heat that is different than diesel? So I was privileged enough to go up. I've been up half a dozen times in the last year or so, and kind of helped lead the team to try to figure out some solutions. It's a beautiful community, about 1,000 people. Most of the time is spent fishing, collecting firewood, and hunting. And rather than saying, okay, let's figure out a solution for the whole community, right away at the very beginning, they said, is there a solution for the school, which is the largest building in the community? That's the thing over on the left, and the cluster of buildings that's down by the lake. One of them is the Head Start building, the medical center, a couple of other buildings. Are there solutions to that? So what we've proposed is essentially 3 different energy systems. On the right-hand side, that is lake-based geothermal. The ground is too cold to do ground-based geothermal. We could do vertical boring, but that means trying to bring in a big drill. And if you bring in a big drill, most of the money will get spent on people who don't live in the community. So, turns out you can extract heat from the lake, and you can heat the buildings down by the lake. For the school, we're proposing to put in a biomass, essentially a wood boiler, that would tie into the current system in the school and would replace virtually all of the diesel there as well. It also will have a pipe, underground pipe that goes down to the lake to be a backup heating system for the buildings down by the lake. Because having the heat go out for a day or 2 or 3 is not an option. So what this will do, aside from allowing, reduce the amount of diesel by about 1/3 that's currently being used for heat, is it'll create local jobs. And so for this community, this solution is only intended to be a first step solution. There are 200 some odd houses, there are another 10 or 15 buildings, but this is where we would start. So 0 fossil fuel in those buildings, jobs, and increased profit. Think about what's going on inside the economy of this community. Right now, money comes in from the federal government. It pays for fuel to come in, about $1 million a year for fuel, another $1 million a year to ship it, somewhere around there, and then about another $1 million a year to clean it up. Virtually none of that money stays in the community. So if instead we can hire local people to go out and cut down wood from the forest fires that have happened around the community and create heat and have them do the geothermal, then the money stays in the community. It's more profitable, more attractive, both for job-based and for environmental-based. The other part that has to go into this is all of this requires electricity to run. You need electricity for the heat pumps, you need electricity for the biomass pumps. Electricity up there, which is also produced by a different diesel system, is incredibly expensive. So, Evolve Green is helping us design the photovoltaic arrays that will be used to create the electricity for them. So it's actually a 3-part system. So again, the solution isn't technological. None of these 3 things are new technology, wildly innovative, none of that kind of stuff. There are lots and lots of other places. What is new is that all three would be coordinated together, and most of the work would be done and managed by the local community. When we were thinking about how to do this, we decided let's come up with a broader model for how you make these kind of systemic changes that include energy for a community but aren't only about energy. There's a whole world of community planning. There's lots of complicated ways of trying to do it, and we decided let's actually simplify it down to 3 ideas: energy, food, and waste. And so far, we've only been concentrating on heat energy, but in future years, we're going to try to figure out some solutions for electric energy. And we've also been talking a little bit about consumer waste, because any society produces waste. This society doesn't have a way of recycling yet. So over time, the waste just accumulates. But the longer term solution is to think about all of the waste, all of the energy, and all of the food that's involved in this community. And the kind of breakthrough for us was to realize that these 3 things are all connected. So, for instance, whenever you create food, you create waste out of the food. Organic waste. If we harvest wood for the biomass system, we can take wood chips from the material that we've collected, put it together with the organic waste, make compost, and use that to grow local food in a local greenhouse. But we'll need energy to put into that greenhouse in order to make that greenhouse sustainable. So in every case, it's not just you have 3 issues you're trying to deal with, it's also you're trying to figure out how you connect the 3 issues together, how each of those can help the other one. So that's, in very short sketch, that's a community plan with the beginnings of a larger model that might be applicable to other communities. The other plan is a red-green plan. I think I have 3 minutes left. 5 minutes, oh well, I'll talk slow then. The red-green plan. When you think about energy, in any community, any group of individuals, an individual house, an entire province, entire planet, you really only have 3 kinds of action that you can take if you want to make the energy less polluting and more sustainable, and 3 areas of focus. You can do one or all of 3 things. You can increase how much renewables you're using. Manitoba currently uses about 30% of all of our energy comes from renewables, almost entirely from hydro. You can increase efficiency. So somebody is going to win a package of LED bulbs at the back. That increases efficiency. Or you can reduce demand. We're working on Providence, and some of the communities around Providence are working on setting up a rural transit system. So the amount of demand of individual riding that will happen, you get in your car and have to drive somewhere, that will go down. And I suppose you could call that an increase in efficiency, but it's actually, I guess I would call it a reduction in demand for personal transportation. So any one of those 3 things. And there's really only 3 areas: heating and cooling, moving stuff around, and what we call electricity. Now, of course, this is not a very good set of distinctions, because sometimes we use electricity for heating and cooling and for transportation. But what we mean by that is it's everything else we use electricity for that isn't in those first 2 categories. So if you take those and make them into a matrix, and this is a real matrix, not like that silly movie. It's a 3x3 matrix. I teach business. In business, most of it seems to be done, most of strategy seems to be done in 2x2 matrices. So this one's more complicated. It's a 3x3 matrix. So you can take this little grid and think about your life, your home, your community, Providence University College, Northlands, Steinbeck, and say, What can we do in each of those categories? How can we increase renewables in heating and cooling? There's one way we can increase renewables in heating and cooling. How can we increase efficiency? There's one way we increase efficiency in heating and cooling. How can we reduce demand? How can we increase renewables, efficiency, and reduce demand in transportation? One of the most interesting things that's happened from being part of those groups is I've got to know the Manitoba Trucking Association. Wait, I thought those were the enemy. Manitoba Trucking, on-road freight transportation, produces 18%, something like that, of all of the CO2 we produce in Manitoba. It's a really large amount. They wouldn't produce any if we didn't ask for stuff to be brought in and sold to us. And they're not going to go out of business just because somebody tries to tell them they're doing a bad job or doing a bad thing. However, if you offer them a possibility, they're interested in being part of a solution. So we've been working with them for the last year to increase the efficiency of trucks, heavy-duty trucks. It turns out that there are some really already established workable technologies that can make a truck 30% more efficient. Side skirts, wide-base tires, fairings, there's a bunch of other things, anti-idling equipment. All of this technology works already, and it took a year and a half to get the government to change some of the regulations, but now it's possible to make more trucks more efficient. So that would be an increase efficiency on transportation. And you can do the same thing in any one of the boxes, and if you do it in all of them, then you've done what those 21 other countries have done. And you move from being essentially nowhere in this process to being one of the leaders. If you look at what the Denmark policy has been, it's essentially these 12 things, these 9 things. Some of them have emphasized more and less, but they all fit within these boxes. So when you're thinking about what is it we can do, how can we do it, where can we do it, just pick one of these boxes, or 2 or 3 of these boxes, and start. Thank you.